Tonight, the focus shifts to the waters surrounding the conflict, where a new dimension of the war has taken shape. According to the article, Ukrainian naval drones have struck 2 Russian tankers, marking a significant development in how this war is being fought beyond land. This is not a traditional battlefield, not trenches, not armored columns, but open water where movement, supply, and energy routes intersect. And according to the report, Ukraine is now extending its reach into that space using naval drone technology. The article describes how these strikes were carried out as part of a broader effort targeting what is described as Russia's shadow oil fleet. That phrase carries weight because it points not just to military activity, but to economic lifelines connected to the ongoing war. And according to the report, Ukrainian actions are now directly intersecting with those maritime operations. You know, conflicts often evolve in ways that are not immediately visible at first glance. They expand, they adapt, they find new fronts. And according to the article, this development reflects exactly that kind of evolution. Naval drones operating remotely, striking tankers, disrupting movement at sea. The report does not describe chaos. It describes precision. It describes intent. It describes a widening scope of operations. There are moments when the battlefield quietly expands beyond where we expect it. That feeling sits right at the center of this report because what is being described here is not just an isolated strike, it is part of a pattern. According to the article, Ukrainian leadership, including President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, is directing attention toward Russia's maritime oil operations, and specifically toward vessels described as part of a shadow fleet. Now, the article does not redefine that fleet. It does not speculate. It simply presents it as part of the operational context. And within that context, these tanker strikes take on added meaning, because they are not random. They are targeted, they are intentional. And according to the report, they represent an extension of Ukrainian strategy into the maritime domain. You can almost feel how this changes the tone of the conflict, because once operations move into energy transport routes, the implications shift. Supply, economics, movement, all become part of the same battlefield. And according to the article, Ukrainian naval drones are now playing a role in that shift. The report also reflects how technology continues shaping the way this war unfolds. Naval drones are not large fleets. They are not traditional warships. They are smaller, more agile, remotely operated systems. And yet, according to the article, they are now capable of reaching and striking large tanker vessels. That contrast matters because it shows how different scales of technology can intersect on the same battlefield and how innovation continues influencing outcomes. There's a quiet intensity when something small changes something so large. That line captures something essential about what's being described, because according to the report, relatively compact drone systems are now interacting with major maritime infrastructure, and that interaction carries both operational and symbolic weight. The article also emphasizes that these developments are part of a broader effort, not isolated incidents, repeated patterns, strategic focus, expanding reach. And according to the report, Ukrainian forces are continuing to apply pressure in ways that extend beyond traditional front lines. Again, the article avoids exaggeration. It does not claim decisive turning points. It does not suggest immediate outcomes. Instead, it carefully outlines how these strikes fit into an ongoing pattern of military activity and how that pattern is now extending into maritime zones. You know, wars are not static. They don't stay confined to one space. They move, they stretch, they adapt to new conditions. And according to the article, this is exactly what we are seeing here. Naval drone strikes, tanker targets, maritime pressure, all becoming part of the same evolving conflict. The report also reflects how these actions are connected to broader strategic objectives, not just battlefield control, but disruption. Disruption of movement, disruption of supply, disruption of operations connected to oil transport. And according to the article, these drone strikes align with that broader direction. Again and again, the report returns to one central idea: expansion. The expansion of where and how the conflict is being fought, from land to sea, from trenches to tankers, from direct confrontation to strategic targeting. And according to the article, Ukrainian naval drone operations are now a clear part of that expansion. Tonight, according to the report, Ukrainian forces have struck 2 Russian tankers using naval drones as part of a broader effort targeting maritime oil operations associated with Russia's shadow fleet. And with that, the battlefield continues to widen. As the article continues, the attention moves deeper into how these naval drone strikes reflect a changing strategic landscape in the war between Ukraine and Russia. According to the report, the targeting of 2 Russian tankers was not presented as an isolated event. Instead, it was described within the broader framework of Ukraine's effort to pressure what the article refers to as Russia's shadow oil fleet. That phrase appears repeatedly because it sits at the center of the operation being described. And according to the report, Ukrainian leadership is increasingly focusing on the maritime networks connected to Russian oil transport. Once conflict begins affecting transportation routes and energy movement, the atmosphere changes because those systems operate far beyond front lines. They connect economies, they connect supply chains, they connect international movement across regions and waterways. And according to the article, Ukrainian naval drone operations are now directly intersecting with those networks. The report reflects how maritime warfare itself has evolved during this conflict. Traditionally, naval confrontations often involved large vessels, fleet deployments, and visible military formations. But according to the article, the current environment looks very different. Smaller, unmanned naval systems are now being used in operations involving major tanker targets. That contrast gives the report much of its tension. Because the operational scale appears uneven at first glance. Small drone systems, large maritime vessels, yet according to the article, those systems are proving capable of carrying out significant operations against strategically important targets. There are times when the quietest machines carry the loudest consequences. That feeling moves carefully beneath the structure of the report, because these operations are described not through spectacle, but through strategic effect. The article also highlights how Ukraine continues adapting technologically across multiple dimensions of the war: land, air, and now increasingly maritime space. According to the report, naval drones are becoming another operational layer through which Ukraine applies pressure against Russian systems and infrastructure. Again, the article remains measured. It does not speculate about long-term outcomes. It does not present dramatic predictions. Instead, it focuses carefully on what has occurred and how those events fit into broader operational patterns. And according to the report, those patterns increasingly include Ukrainian maritime drone activity directed at oil transport operations. You can almost sense how the geography of the war is continuing to shift. Not only cities and front lines, but coastlines, shipping corridors, energy routes. And according to the article, those areas are now becoming more directly connected to active military operations. The report also reflects how technology is reducing traditional operational boundaries. Distance matters differently now. Access matters differently now. And according to the article, unmanned naval systems are allowing Ukraine to extend operational reach into maritime environments previously associated mainly with larger naval powers. That shift carries both strategic and symbolic importance, because it reflects adaptation under pressure, innovation under wartime conditions. And according to the report, Ukraine is increasingly using those capabilities against Russian-linked maritime activity. There's something haunting about a battlefield that suddenly reaches the sea. That quiet line almost captures the emotional undertone of the report itself, because the article describes not merely isolated attacks, but an expanding operational environment where conflict now touches shipping lanes and maritime infrastructure. Again and again, the report emphasizes intention, targeted operations, strategic pressure, focused objectives. And according to the article, these naval drone strikes were connected specifically to efforts aimed at Russia's shadow oil fleet. The article also reflects how modern warfare increasingly combines military operations with economic pressure. That combination appears clearly throughout the report, because oil transportation carries significance beyond individual vessels alone. It relates to movement, revenue, logistics, operational continuity, and according to the article, Ukrainian actions are now increasingly intersecting with those systems at sea. Again, the report avoids sensational language. It does not claim immediate disruption across all maritime operations. It does not suggest complete operational shutdowns. Instead, it carefully documents how Ukrainian drone operations are now reaching into areas connected to Russian oil transport activity. That careful tone strengthens the credibility of the report, because warfare often evolves through gradual expansion rather than sudden transformation. And according to the article, this maritime dimension of the conflict appears to be growing steadily more important. You know, one of the defining characteristics of this war has been adaptation. Every phase introduces new methods, new technologies, new operational approaches. And according to the report, naval drone warfare is now becoming one of the clearest examples of that continuing evolution. The article also reflects how maritime operations create different forms of pressure compared to land combat. Visibility changes, movement changes, response times change, and according to the article, those differences are now shaping how Ukraine approaches operations involving Russian-linked tanker targets. Again and again, the report returns to the idea of expanding operational reach, not necessarily through conventional naval dominance, but through flexibility, precision, technological innovation. And according to the article, Ukrainian naval drones are increasingly becoming part of that broader strategy. Tonight, according to the report, Ukrainian naval drone strikes against 2 Russian tankers represent an expanding maritime phase of the conflict, as operations increasingly target Russian-linked oil transport networks associated with what the article describes as the shadow fleet. As this report reaches its closing stage, the broader significance of these Ukrainian naval drone operations becomes increasingly clear. According to the article, the strikes on 2 Russian tankers were not presented simply as isolated battlefield events. They were described as part of a widening operational effort connected to Russia's shadow oil fleet and the maritime system surrounding it. That wider context matters because it shows how the war continues extending into new spaces, new methods, and new forms of pressure. And according to the report, maritime drone warfare is now becoming a visible part of that transformation. You know, wars often reveal how quickly military realities can change once technology reshapes access and reach. What once required fleets can now involve unmanned systems. What once depended on direct confrontation can now involve remote precision. And according to the article, Ukrainian naval drones are increasingly demonstrating those changes in real operational conditions. The report reflects how these operations combine multiple layers at once: military pressure, strategic messaging, economic targeting, maritime disruption, and according to the article, the tanker strikes sit directly within that broader framework. Again, the article remains careful in its wording. It does not describe total disruption. It does not claim decisive conclusions. Instead, it focuses on how these strikes fit into an evolving conflict where maritime activity now carries growing operational importance. That measured approach gives the report its weight, because the significance comes not from dramatic language, but from the pattern itself. And according to the article, that pattern is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. There are moments when a war quietly changes shape before the world fully notices. That feeling lingers across the closing portions of the report, because this is no longer a conflict confined only to trenches and artillery positions. According to the article, naval routes, tanker operations, and maritime infrastructure are now becoming increasingly connected to active military pressure. The report also reflects how Ukrainian strategy continues adapting under prolonged wartime conditions. Flexibility remains central. Technology remains central. Operational creativity remains central. And according to the article, naval drones are now one of the clearest examples of that adaptation process unfolding in real time. You can almost feel how differently modern warfare operates compared to earlier generations. Distance offers less protection. Large infrastructure carries new vulnerabilities. And according to the article, Relatively compact naval drone systems are now capable of reaching strategically important maritime targets connected to Russian oil operations. That contrast carries enormous symbolic force. Small systems, large consequences. And according to the report, Ukraine is increasingly leveraging that reality. The article also reflects how maritime operations create uncertainty far beyond the immediate location of a strike. Shipping routes depend on predictability. Transport depends on confidence. Movement depends on security. And according to the article, Ukrainian naval drone activity is now contributing to new layers of pressure within those maritime environments. Again and again, the report returns to one central idea: expansion, the expansion of methods, the expansion of operational zones, the expansion of technological warfare into areas once considered secondary to the battlefield itself. And according to the article, the sea is now clearly part of that battlefield. There's a silence at sea that feels different once conflict arrives there. That quiet line almost captures the emotional atmosphere surrounding the report itself, because maritime warfare carries a different kind of tension: long distances, open water, limited visibility. And according to the article, naval drones are increasingly reshaping how those environments are approached during the conflict. The report also highlights how Ukraine's operations continue focusing on strategic pressure rather than symbolic gestures alone. According to the article, the strikes targeted Russian tankers associated with broader oil transport activity. That operational focus matters enormously, because energy systems remain deeply connected to wartime endurance and logistical capability. Again, the article avoids speculation. It does not predict future escalation. It does not claim immediate strategic transformation. Instead, it carefully documents how Ukrainian naval drone operations are now intersecting directly with maritime oil transportation linked to Russia. That restraint strengthens the report's credibility, because military developments are often most important when they become consistent rather than dramatic. And according to the article, Ukrainian maritime drone operations are becoming increasingly consistent within the broader structure of the war. You know, one of the defining realities of this conflict has been constant adaptation. Every phase introduces something new: new tactics, new technologies, new operational spaces. And according to the report, naval drones now represent one of the clearest examples of how rapidly warfare continues evolving between Ukraine and Russia. The article closes with a sense that maritime pressure is no longer peripheral. It is increasingly central, not replacing land warfare, not replacing aerial warfare, but becoming another interconnected layer of the conflict itself. And according to the report, Ukrainian operations targeting Russian-linked tanker activity are now firmly part of that evolving reality. Tonight, according to the article, Ukrainian naval drones struck 2 Russian tankers as President Volodymyr Zelenskyy continues targeting maritime oil operations associated with Russia's shadow fleet, signaling an expanding maritime dimension to the ongoing war. Sometimes the shape of a conflict changes long before the maps do.